Today, we'll present the relationship between labor earnings and labor productivity in Hong Kong. So, the topic of labor earnings and labor productivity has been quite popular among economists. Labor earnings refer to the income earned by labor within an economy, and labor productivity refers to the actual output produced by unit of labor. Now, according to a renowned economic observation called the Calder's stylized fact, national income distributed to labor and capital should be roughly constant over long periods of time. In other words, labor earnings and capital earnings should grow at a consistent rate in the long run. However, recent studies show that labor share of income has actually decreased in several economies, especially with those that have gone through industrialization and globalization. This is a critical discovery that suggests macroeconomic development over a certain level might not translate to a higher well-being of households. These studies state that factors such as globalization, capital deepening, technology improvements, and depreciation can lead to a reduction in labor share of income for some developed economies.
So the goal of our research is to see whether findings of recent studies of decreasing labor share of income in developed economies also apply to the Hong Kong economy. And to do this, we first have to quantify some of the variables. So we define labor productivity as real GDP per person engaged and labor earnings as real payroll per person. Next, we compare the cumulative growth rates of each variable to observe the long-run change. Since we assume national income is distributed between the two factors of production, which are capital and labor, cumulative growth rates of real GDP per person and real payroll should be roughly similar. If this is not true, it means that income is not being distributed evenly between capital and labor. Not only do we compare labor productivity and labor earnings of the overall Hong Kong economy, we also do this for 8 important industries to see if the overall result is consistent with the results seen in each industry. And these 8 industries include financing and insurance services industry, real estate services industry, accommodation and food services industry, professional and business services industry, information and communication industry, imports and exports and wholesale retail trade industry, transportation, postal and courier industry, and manufacturing industry. In addition, since the earliest data on real payroll started from 2004, our study period is limited from 2005 to 2019, which is over a 15-year period. And all our data was extracted from the official website of Census and Statistics Department of Hong Kong.
If we look at the data results section, we see that in the overall economy, the cumulative growth rate of real GDP per person is higher than the cumulative growth rate of real payroll per person. This is illustrated by the graph, where the purple trend indicates the cumulative growth rate of real GDP per person, and yellow trend indicates the cumulative growth rate of real payroll. Thus, it seems that labor earnings grew at a lower rate than labor productivity in the overall economy. Out of the 8 specific industries we have discussed, 4 industries, including financing and insurance, accommodation and food services, professional and business services, and real estate services, displayed results contradicting from the result of all sector graph, which we will elaborate in the data analysis section. Although the results seem to suggest that labor share of income decreased in Hong Kong over the 15-year period, we show that what we see on the surface might not be the absolute truth.
So if we look at the data analysis section, our group interpreted data in 4 different ways. First, if you look at the CPI versus GDP deflator section, we theorized that the gap between cumulative growth rates of real GDP per person and real payroll might be a result of measurement difference rather than a reduction in labor share of income. It is important to acknowledge the fact that we used real values. So we used real national output and real payroll for comparison, and real values are derived by adjusting for inflation of nominal values. The key point is that GDP is adjusted for inflation using the GDP deflator, and labor earnings, so payroll, is adjusted for inflation using a different measurement index called the Consumer Price Index, also known as CPI. Hence, we compared the cumulative growth rates of CPI and GDP deflator for our study period and found out that CPI usually overstated the cost of living compared to the GDP deflator. And if you look at the graph, the yellow line depicts the cumulative percentage change in CPI, and the purple line depicts the cumulative percentage change in GDP deflator. And we see that the yellow trend is located at a higher position than the purple trend. So CPI, indeed, the cumulative percentage change in CPI indeed exceeds the cumulative percentage change in GDP deflator. In other words, once we subtract the inflation effect from nominal values, real payroll per person should be smaller than real GDP per person.
Second, we attempted to use a different measure of labor productivity to understand the 3 of 4 industries that deviated from our overall result, which are financing and insurance services, accommodation and food services, and professional and business services industry. If we take a look at the 3 graphs, we see that the purple trend is not always above the yellow trend, and in fact, the cumulative growth rate of real payroll per person is higher than cumulative growth rate of real GDP per person for some years. However, if we adopt a different measure of labor productivity provided by the Census and Statistics Department of Hong Kong, which is a measure that uses labor hour and not per person as a labor input, we see that labor productivity in fact grew at a higher rate compared to the labor earnings for our study period, which is consistent with our overall result. Thus, we can infer from this result that average hours worked decreased at a faster pace than the increase in the number of persons engaged in these industries. In other words, there is not enough evidence to conclude that labor earnings increase more than labor productivity, and the difference in observed data is caused mostly by the difference in measurement.
Thirdly, if the gap we see in the data was indeed caused by a decreasing labor share of income, we should be able to explain the gap with factors that appear in other published studies such as globalization, capital deepening, improvements in technology, and depreciation. We define globalization as the size of the trade sector relative to overall output, which is GDP. So, if globalization increases, the relative size of the trade sector should increase as well. Capital deepening refers to the increase in the proportion of capital stock to the labor input, so we compile the time series of capital to labor ratio in the Hong Kong economy. If this ratio increased over time, it would indicate that capital deepening occurred over the study period. However, research showed that neither globalization nor capital deepening intensified over the recent 15 years, suggesting that the gap between the cumulative growth rates of real GDP per person and real payroll per person might not be a result of popular factors mentioned in major studies.
So fourth, we used industry-specific reasons to explain the deviation we observe in the real estate services industry. Unlike other industries where real GDP person and real payroll per person increased over the study period, real payroll per person over the 15 years increased, while real GDP per person decreased in the real estate industry. And to explain why the real estate industry displays such a unique trend among our data samples, we determined factors that influenced real GDP and real payroll. So we found out that labor earnings and output in this industry can each be explained by their correlation with housing price and transaction volume. Because real GDP per person is positively correlated with real estate transaction volume, real GDP per person declined over the 15 years as transaction volume decreased over the years as well. To add, labor earnings is positively correlated with housing price as real estate workers are highly dependent on commissions they earn on each contract. This is illustrated by the regression table on the poster, where we can see that a 1% increase in the Census City Leading Index, which is a housing price index in Hong Kong that is widely used, leads to a 0.1285% increase in real payroll per person. And because housing price has increased over the 15 years, we can understand why real payroll has increased while real output has decreased.
In conclusion, At first, looking at the results from our data seemed to suggest that labor share of income has decreased over the last 15 years in Hong Kong. However, further analysis illustrate that the difference between cumulative growth rates of labor productivity and labor earnings might not indicate significant reduction in labor share of income. But the difference can be explained because of measurement differences. Plus, a significant deviation we observe in the real estate services industry can be justified with industry-specific reasons. The conclusion of our research seems to be contradicting findings published by other studies. Thus, we can consider Hong Kong as a unique sample out of a pool of developed economies, and further studies should be conducted to analyze why labor share of income might not have decreased in Hong Kong compared to the other economies.
Of course, there are several flaws in our study, and the main flaw is derived from the fact that we use a study period of 15 years, which can be considered significantly short, to derive a meaningful conclusion. In addition, we assume that labor and capital were the only two building blocks of the economy, but in reality, there are other important factors such as technology and human capital that affect the long-run output of the economy. Although a more significant conclusion can be derived from conducting series of studies upon improving these flaws, the conclusion that labor share of income in Hong Kong might not have decreased over the recent 15 years is still significant, as it indicates that a developed economy might experience growth without having its labor share of income decrease. So this is the end of our presentation, and thank you for listening.